I have to do a lot of thinking to try to understand what I even feel. I don't know. But in terms of information, the thing that the soldiers are saying, the Russian soldiers are saying, the thing the Russian soldiers really believe is that they're liberating the Ukrainian people from Nazis.
Mm.
And they believe this. Because I visited Ukraine, I spoke to over 100, probably a couple hundred Ukrainian people from different walks of life. It feels like the Russian soldiers, at least, are under a cloud of propaganda. They're not operating on a clear view of the whole world. And given all that, I just don't see Russia taking the South without committing war crimes. And if Vladimir Putin is aware of what's happening in terms of the treatment of civilians, I don't see him pushing forward all the way to take the South, because that's not going to be effective strategy for him to win the hearts and minds of these people.
Autocracies don't need to win hearts and minds. That's a staunchly democratic point of view. Hearts and minds mean very little to people who understand core, basic needs and true power. You don't see Xi Jinping worrying about hearts and minds in China. You don't see it in North Korea. You don't see it in Congo. You don't see it in most of the world. Hearts and minds are a luxury. In reality, what people need is food, water, power. They need income to be able to secure a lifestyle. It is absolutely sad. I am not in any way, shape, or form saying that my assessment on this is enriching or enlightening or hopeful. It's just fact. It's just calculatable empirical evidence. If Putin loses in Ukraine, the losses, the influential losses, the economic losses, the lives lost, the power lost is too great. So it is better for him to push and push and push through war crimes, through everything else. War crimes are something defined by the international court system. The international court system has Russia as part of its board. And the international court system is largely powerless outside when it comes to enforcing its own outcomes. So the real risk gain scenario here for Russia is significantly in favor of gain over risk. The other thing that I think is important to talk about is everybody is trapped in the middle of a gigantic information war. Yes, there's battlefield bullets and cannons and tanks, but there's also a massive informational war. The same narrative that you see these ground troops in Ukraine, these Russian ground troops in Ukraine, believing they're clearing the land of Nazis, that information is being fed to them from their own home country. I don't know why people seem to think that the information that they're reading in English is any more or less true. Every piece of news coming out of the West, every piece of information coming out in the English language is also a giant narrative being shared intentionally to try to undermine the morale and the faithfulness of English-speaking Russians, which somebody somewhere knows exactly how many of those there are. So we have to recognize that we're not getting true information from other side, because there is a strategic value in making sure that there is just the right amount of mis or disinformation out there. Not because someone's trying to lie to Americans, but because someone is trying to influence the way English-speaking Russians think. And in that world, that's exactly why you see so many news articles cited to anonymous sources, government officials who do not want to be named. There's nothing that links back responsibility there, right? There's nothing that can go to court there. But the information still gets released, and that's enough to make Ukrainians believe that the United States is going to help them, or that the West is going to help them. It's enough to make Russians think that they're going to lose, and maybe they should just give up now and leave from the battlefield now. We have to understand we are in the middle of a giant information war.
Maybe you can correct me, but it feels like in the English speaking world, it's harder to control it's harder to fight the information war because of, some people say there's not really a freedom of speech in this country, but I think if you compare, there's a lot more freedom of speech, and it's just harder to control narratives when there's a bunch of guerrilla journalists that are able to just publish anything they want on Twitter or anything. It's just harder to control narratives.
So people don't understand what freedom of speech is. That's the first major problem. And it's shameful how many people in the United States do not understand what freedom of speech actually protects. So that aside, you're absolutely right. Fighting the information war in the West is extremely difficult because anyone with a blog, anyone with a Twitter account, anyone can call themselves a journalist, essentially. We live in a country where people read the headline and they completely bypass the author line and they go straight into the content. And then they decide whether the content's real or not based on how they feel instead of based on empirical, measurable evidence.
So you mentioned the Lend-Lease Act and the support of the United States, support of Ukraine by the United States. Are you skeptical to the level of support that the United States is providing and is going to provide over time?
The strategy that the United States has taken to support Ukraine is similar to the strategy we took to support Great Britain during World War II. The enactment of the Lend-Lease Act is a perfect example of that. The Lend-Lease Act means that we are lending or leasing equipment to the Ukrainian government in exchange for future payment. So every time a rocket is launched, every time a drone crashes into a tank, that's a bill that Ukraine is just racking up. It's like when you go to a restaurant and you start drinking shots. Sometime the bill will come due. This is exactly what we did when Europe and when Great Britain was in the face of Nazi invasion. We signed the same thing into motion. Do you know that the UK did not pay off the debt from World War II until 2020? They've been paying that debt since the end of World War II. So what we're doing is we're indebting Ukraine against the promise that perhaps they will secure their freedom, which nobody seems to want to talk about what freedom is actually going to look like for Ukrainians, right? What are the true handful of outcomes, the realistic outcomes that could come of this, and which of those outcomes really looks like freedom to them, especially in the face of the fact that they're going to be trillions of dollars in debt to the West for supplying them with the training and the weapons and the food and the med kits and everything else that we're giving them, because none of it's free. It's all coming due. We're a democracy, but we're also a capitalist country. We can't afford to just give things away for free, but we can give things away at a discount. We can give things away layaway, but the bill will come due. And unfortunately, that is not part of the conversation that's being had with the American people.
So debt is a way to establish some level of control.
Power.
Is power. That said, having a very close relationship between Ukraine and the United States does not seem to be a negative possibility when Ukrainians think about their future in terms of freedom. That's one thing. And the other, there's some aspect of this war that I've just noticed that one of the people I talked to said that all great nations have a independence war, have to have a war for their independence. There's something, it's dark, but there's something about war just being a catalyst for finding your own identity as a nation. So you can have leaders, you can have sort of signed documents, you can have all this kind of stuff, but there's something about war that really brings the country together and actually try to figure out what is at the core of the spirit of the people that defines this country. And they see this war as the independence war to define the heart of what the country is. So there's been before the war, before this invasion, there was a lot of factions in the country. There was a lot of influence from oligarchs and corruption and so on. A lot of that was the factions were brought together under one umbrella, effectively to become one nation because of this invasion. So they see that as a positive direction for the defining of what a free democratic country looks like after the war, in their perspective, after the war is won.
It's a difficult situation because I'm trying to make sure that you and everybody listening understands that what's happening in Ukraine among Ukrainians is noble and brave. and courageous and beyond the expectations of anyone. The fact is, there is no material support coming from the outside. The American Revolution was won because of French involvement. French ships, French troops, French generals, French military might. The independence of communist China was won through Russian support, Russian generals, Russian troops on the ground fighting with the communists. That's how revolutions are won. That's how independent countries are born. Ukraine doesn't get any of that. No one is stepping into that because we live in a world right now where there simply is no economic benefit to the parties in power to support Ukraine to that level. And war is a game of economics. The economic benefit of Ukraine is crystal clear in favor of Russia, which is why Putin cannot lose. He will not let himself lose. Short of something completely unexpected, right? I'm talking 60%, 70% probability Ukraine loses. But there's still 20%, 30% probability of the unimaginable happening. Who knows what that might be? An oligarch assassinates Putin, or a nuclear bomb goes off somewhere, or who knows what, right? There's still a chance that something unexpected will happen and change the tide of the war. But when it comes down to the core calculus here, Ukraine is the agricultural bed to support a future Russia. Russia knows they have to have Ukraine. They know that they have to have it to protect themselves against military pressure from the West. They have to have it for agricultural reasons. They have major oil and natural gas pipelines that flow through eastern Ukraine. They cannot let Ukraine fall outside of their sphere of influence. They cannot. The United States doesn't really have any economic vested interest in Ukraine. Ideological points of view and promises aside, there's no economic benefit. And the same thing goes for NATO. NATO has no economic investment in Ukraine. Ukrainian output, Ukrainian food goes to the Middle East and Africa. It doesn't go to Europe. So the West siding with Ukraine is exclusively ideological, and it's putting them in a place where they fight a war with Russia so the whole world can see Russia's capabilities. Ukraine is as sad as it is to say, man, Ukraine is a pawn on a table for superpowers to calculate each other's capacities. Right now, we've only talked about Russia and the United States. We haven't even talked about Iran. We haven't even talked about China, right? It is a pawn on a table. This is a chicken fight so that people get to watch and see what the other trainers are doing.
Well, a lot of people might have said the same thing about the United States back in the independence fight. So there is possibilities, as you've said. We're not saying 0% chance, and it could be a reasonably high percent chance that this becomes one of the great democratic nations that the 21st century is remembered by.
Absolutely.
And so you said American support. So ideologically, first of all, you don't assign much long-term power to that U.S. could support Ukraine purely on ideological grounds.
Just look in the last 4 years, the last 3 years. Do you remember what happened in Hong Kong right before COVID? China swooped into Hong Kong violently, beating protesters, killing them in the street, imprisoning people without just cause. And Hong Kong was a democracy. And the whole world stood by and let it happen. And then what happened in Afghanistan just a year ago? And the whole world stood by and let the Taliban take power again after 20 years of loss. We are showing a repeatable point of view. We will talk, American politicians, American administrations, we will say a lot of things. We will promise a lot of ideological, pro-democracy, rah-rah statements. We will say it. But when it comes down to putting our own people, our own economy, our own GDP at risk, we step away from that fight.
America is currently supplying military equipment to Ukraine.
Absolutely.
And a lot of that military equipment has actually been the thing that turned the tides of war a couple of times already. Currently, that's the HIMARS systems. So you mentioned sort of Putin can't afford to lose. but winning can look in different ways. So you've
Correct.
kind of defined so on at this moment. The prediction is that winning looks like capturing not just the east, but the south of Ukraine. But you can have narratives of winning that return back to the what was at the beginning of this year before the invasion.
Correct.
That Crimea is still with Russia. There's some kind of negotiated thing about Donbass where it still stays with Ukraine, but there's some
Puppet government, or
yeah,
just like,
something
that's
this.
what they have in Georgia right now,
And that could still be defined through mechanisms
as Russia winning.
as Russia winning for Russia, and then for Ukraine as Ukraine winning, and for the West as democracy winning, and you kind of negotiate. I mean, that seems to be how geopolitics works. Is
Correct.
everybody can walk away with a win-win story, and then the world progresses
Correct.
with lessons learned.
That's that's the most probable outcome. The most probable outcome is that Ukraine remains, in air quotes, a sovereign nation. It's not going to be truly sovereign because it will have to have new government put in place. It's extremely unlikely he will be president because he has gone too far to demonstrate his power over the people and his ability to separate the Ukrainian people from the autocratic power of Russia. So he would have to be unseated. Whether he goes into exile or whether he is peacefully left alone is all going to be part of the negotiations. But the thing to keep in mind also is that a negotiated peace really just means a negotiated ceasefire. We've seen this happen all over the world. North Korea and South Korea are technically still just in a negotiated ceasefire. What you end up having is Russia will allow Ukraine to call itself Ukraine, to operate independently, to have their own debt to the United States. Russia doesn't want to take on that debt. And then in exchange for that, they will have firmer guidelines as to how NATO can engage with Ukraine. And then that becomes an example for all the other former Soviet satellite states, which are all required economically by Russia, not required economically by the West. And then you end up seeing how you can see how the whole thing plays out once you realize that the keystone is Ukraine.
There's something about Ukraine, the deep support by the Ukrainian people of America, that is in contrast with, for example, Afghanistan. That it seems like ideologically, Ukraine could be a beacon of freedom used in narratives by the United States to fight geopolitical wars in that part of the world, that they would be a good partner for this idea of democracy, of freedom, of all the values that America stands for. They're a good partner. And so it's valuable if you sort of have a cynical, pragmatic view, sort of like Henry Kissinger type of view. It's valuable to have them as a partner, so valuable that it makes sense to support them in achieving a negotiated ceasefire that's on the side of Ukraine. But because of this particular leader, this particular culture, this particular dynamics of how the war unrolled, and things like Twitter and the way digital communication currently works, it just seems like this is a powerful symbol of freedom that's useful for the United States, if we're sort of to take the pragmatic view. Don't you think it's possible that United States supports Ukraine financially, militarily enough for it to get an advantage in this war?
I think they've already got an advantage in the war. The fact that the war is still going on demonstrates the asymmetrical advantage. The fact that Russia has stepped up to the negotiating table with them several times without just turning to you remember what happened in Chechnya? Without turning to Chechnya level, just mass blind destruction, which was another Putin war. To see that those things have happened demonstrates the asymmetric advantage that the West is given. I think the true way to look at the benefit of Ukraine as a shining example of freedom in Europe for the West isn't to understand whether or not they could. They absolutely could. It's the question of how valuable is that in Europe? How valuable is Ukraine? Which before February, nobody even thought about Ukraine. And the people who did know about Ukraine knew that it was a extremely corrupt former Soviet state with 20% of its national population self-identifying as Russian. There's a reason Putin went into Ukraine. There's a reason he's been promising he would go into Ukraine for the better part of a decade, because the circumstances were aligned. It was a corrupt country that self-identified as Russian in many ways. It was supposed to be an easier of multiple marks in terms of the former Soviet satellite states to go after. That's all part of the miscalculation that the rest of the world saw too, when we thought it would fall quickly. So to think that it could be a shining example of freedom is accurate, but is it as shining a star as Germany? Is it as shining a star as the UK? Is it as shining a star as Romania? Is it as shining a star as France? It's got a lot of democratic, freedom-based countries in Europe to compete against to be the shining stellar example. And in exchange, on counterpoint to that, it has an extreme amount of strategic value to Russia, which has no interest in making it a shining star of the example of democracy and freedom.
Outside of resource, in terms of the shininess of the star, I would argue yes. If you look at how much it captivated the attention of the world.
The attention of the world has made no material difference, man. That's what I'm saying.
That's your estimation, but are you sure we can't, if you can convert that into political influence, into money, don't you think attention is money?
Attention is money in democracies and capitalist countries. Yes.
Which serves as a counterweight to sort of authoritarian regimes. So for Putin, resources matter. For the United States, also resources matter, but the attention and the belief of the people also matter, because that's how you attain and maintain political power.
So going to that exact example, then I would highlight that our current administration has the lowest approval ratings of any president in history. So if people were very fond of the war going on in Ukraine, wouldn't that counterbalance some of our upset, some of the dissent coming from the economy and some of the dissent coming from the Great Recession or the second great, or the Great Resignation and whatever's happening with the down stock market? You would think that people would feel like they're sacrificing for something if they really believed that Ukraine mattered, that they would stand next to the president who is so staunchly driving and leading the West against this conflict.
Well, I think the opposition to this particular president, I personally believe, has less to do with the policies and more to do with a lot of the other human factors. But
again, empirically, I look at things through a very empirical lens, a very cold, fact-based lens. And there are multiple data points that suggest that the American people ideologically sympathize with Ukraine, but they really just want their gas prices to go down. They really just want to be able to pay less money at the grocery store for their food. And they most definitely don't want their sons and daughters to die in exchange for Ukrainian freedom.
It does hurt me to see the politicization of this war as well. I think that's maybe has to do with the kind of calculation you're referring to, but it seems like it doesn't. It seems like there's a cynical, whatever takes attention of the media for the moment, the red team chooses one side and the blue team chooses another. And then I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the Democrats went into full support of Ukraine on the ideological side, and then I guess Republicans are saying, why are we wasting money? The prices the gas prices are going up. That's a very crude kind of analysis, but they basically picked whatever argument on whatever side. And now more and more and more, this particular war in Ukraine is becoming a kind of pawn in the game of politics that's first the midterm elections, then building up towards the presidential elections, and stops being about the philosophical, the social, the geopolitical aspects, parameters of this war, and more about just whatever the heck captivates Twitter, and we're going to use that for politics.
You're right in the sense of the fact that I wouldn't say that the red team and the blue team picked opposite sides on this. What I would say is that media discovered that talking about Ukraine wasn't as profitable as talking about something else. The American people who read media or who watch media, they simply became bored reading about news that didn't seem to be changing much. And we turned back into wanting to read about our own economy, and we wanted to hear more about cryptocurrency, and we wanted to hear more about the Kardashians, and that's what we care about. So that's what media writes about. That's how a capitalist market-driven world works, and that's how the United States works. That's why in both red papers and blue papers, red sources and blue sources, you don't see Ukraine being mentioned very much. If anything, I would say that your Republicans are probably more in support of what's happening in Ukraine right now because we're creating new weapon systems. Our military is getting stronger. We're sending these military. We get to test military systems in combat in Ukraine. That's priceless in the world of the military industrial complex. Being able to field test, combat test a weapon without having to sacrifice your own people is incredibly valuable. You get all the data, you get all the performance metrics, but you don't have to put yourself at risk. That is one of the major benefits of what we're seeing from supporting Ukraine with weapons and with troops. The long-term benefit to what will come of this for the United States, practically speaking, in the lens of national security, through military readiness, through future economic benefits, those are super strong. The geopolitical fight is essentially moot because Ukraine is not a geopolitical player. It was not for 70 years. And after this conflict is over, it will not again. Just think about what you were just saying with the American people's attention span to Twitter and whatever's currently going on. If the Ukraine conflict resolved itself today, in any direction, how many weeks do you think before no one talked about Ukraine anymore? Do you think we would make it 2 weeks? Or do you think we'd make it maybe 7 days? It would be headline news for 1 or 2 days, and then we'd be on to something else. It's just an unfortunate reality of how the world works in a capitalist democracy.
Yeah, it just breaks my heart how much, I know that there's Yemen and Syria and
that nobody talks about anymore. Still raging conflicts going on.